Elon Musk is on the verge of blowing up all of his companies that he's worked so hard to build, with his latest feud with Donald Trump that continues to escalate with every new development with the big, beautiful bill. Now that it's passed the Senate, it appears that Elon has temporarily quieted down a little bit on X, but nevertheless, the situation remains very, very tense between the two men, and it's likely to escalate again when the bill returns to the House for more changes, for another vote, and I can't imagine that Elon isn't going to post more inflammatory statements like this one. Every member of Congress who campaigned on reducing government spending and then immediately voted for the biggest debt increase in history should hang their head in shame. They will lose their primary next year if it is the last thing I do on earth. That doesn't sound like a statement from somebody who's going to calm down anytime soon. And Trump is firing back. Number one, talking openly about deporting Elon Musk, which is not an action without parallel, and he's making his own threats. For example, Elon may get more subsidy than any human being in history by far. And without subsidies, Elon would probably have to close up shop and head back home to South Africa. No more rocket launches, satellites, or electric car production, and our country would save a fortune. Perhaps you should have Doge take a good hard look at this. Big money to be saved. But is all of this just bluster? What could Trump really do to Musk when it comes right down to it? And what kind of money would it actually save the U.S. taxpayers? Well, the answer is he could do a lot to damage Elon Musk and SpaceX, and in so doing, he would utterly destroy America's dominance in space. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. This particular bulletin is not something that I'm particularly happy about, and to warn you, if you are an extremely strong supporter of Donald Trump, you think that he can do no wrong, then it's very likely that this episode is going to trigger you. Once again, I want to be clear that other presidents in the past, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have annoyed me, and I'm happy to talk about these things. If you remember the previous NASA administrator that Biden appointed, I was just absolutely loaded with criticism for that guy. But all that having been said, I'm going to be saying some stuff about Trump that may trigger some of you. So if you're not going to be happy with that, then I would say you'd probably want to click off of this video. But let's go ahead and proceed, because right now, at least potentially, U.S. spaceflight is in a very precarious situation because, as all of us probably know by now, the old love affair with Trump and Musk is utterly over. And even though there seemed to be a brief period of time when Elon was content to just sort of focus on his own businesses and stay out of politics for a little while, got right back into it with the whole big, beautiful bill or whatever the hell the thing's called. And he's not backing down, and he is threatening to run opponent candidates against anybody who votes for this bill, starting a new party under his name. A party that will unquestionably fragment the right. Some Republicans will migrate over to his new party because it's likely to appeal much more to conservatives than to liberals, and others will stay with the traditional Republicans instead. Now, this is, of course, a very serious thing that, of course, puts the Democrats potentially into the driver's seat, and Trump is not happy with that at all, and he's making the following threats, and most of us probably aware of that at this point. Number one, he's looking into the possibility of deporting Elon Musk. And number two, he's looking at the possibility of canceling all of SpaceX's contracts. Now, of course, Tesla is going to be losing all of their subsidies, if you want to call that, incentives that the government offers to anybody who wants to buy an electric car. It's not just Tesla, by the way, though. Anybody who sells an electric car is going to lose when those incentives go away. By the way, that includes people like my brother and my father, although, of course, they did take advantage of the incentives while they had the chance, and now they have electric cars. Both of them seem very happy with them, by the way. They're not Teslas, incidentally, but all that having been said, the other thing that Trump is threatening is the cancellation of all of SpaceX's government contracts. So the question is, number one, could Trump do this? Number two, if he did, what would the consequences be and what would the benefits be? I mean, Trump is saying that the U.S. government or the U.S. taxpayers are going to save billions and billions of dollars, big money, as he puts it, if all of these contracts are canceled. Is that true? And what could Musk do to retaliate? I mean, what could he do if he were deported? What would he do if his contracts with SpaceX and everything else that he gets from the government were canceled? Well, there'd be a very good chance that SpaceX would flat out go out of business, because it's not just the contracts that SpaceX has directly with the government. Also, theoretically, the FCC could shut Starlink down as well. It could be utterly devastating to SpaceX. As I say, enough to put them out of business. But if Trump were to do this, if all of this were to go through, it would end U.S. dominance in spaceflight for decades, if not for good. And number two, it wouldn't save the American taxpayers one dime. Now, to make one thing perfectly clear, when it comes to the vast majority of SpaceX's missions, really virtually all of them, none of them really qualify as subsidies, anything but. Perhaps the most lucrative contract that the government has given to SpaceX thus far is the U.S. Space Force contract for future national security launches. SpaceX got the lion's share of the funding, although not a whole lot more than their competitors, $5.92 billion as opposed to $5.4 billion for ULA and $2.4 billion for Blue Origin. But if you drill down into the details of this contract, you get to see just how good of a deal the government is getting from SpaceX. SpaceX contracted 28 missions for that $5.9 billion. That's $210.7 million per launch. That, of course, includes integrating the payload and everything else associated with the security mission that makes these kinds of launches substantially more expensive than an ordinary launch. ULA, by way of comparison, for 19 missions and $5.4 billion is charging $284 million per launch on average. That is $73 million more per launch from ULA than for SpaceX. And with Blue Origin's New Glenn missions, the story gets even worse. For 7 launches, Blue Origin is charging $2.4 billion. That's $342.9 million per launch, $132 million per launch more than SpaceX is charging. Now, granted, bulk is probably what's giving SpaceX a bit of a better deal when it comes right down to it. But imagine what would happen if these two companies had to pick up the slack if Trump were to cancel all future SpaceX national security launches. The cost to the taxpayer would be utterly staggering. Now, given that Blue Origin New Glenn has only just entered service and Blue Origin is really struggling to keep up anything resembling a launch cadence right now, ULA would have to pick up virtually all of the slack. And keep in mind, ULA doesn't have any more Atlas V rockets to use for national security missions, which means Vulcan Centaur would somehow have to be called upon to handle these additional 28 missions. Now, let's assume that ULA gives about a $20 million discount because they're picking up so much additional business, and I think that's pretty generous that they would be able to do something like that, especially given the fact that the government would have no choice but to do business with them. But let's say that they did, and it was only $264 million per launch as opposed to $284. That's still $53 million extra per launch. Multiply that by 28, and you have nearly $1.5 billion worth of extra cost to the taxpayers. Big money to be saved, Mr. Trump? Well, no, actually, I think we're talking about big money here, but big cost to the U.S. taxpayer instead. And it gets worse than that because ULA has never been particularly good at maintaining an extremely high launch cadence, and they have an enormous amount of responsibilities on their plate right now already, not just all the national security launches that they're already scheduled to carry out, but they also have dozens of Kuiper launches for Jeff Bezos that they need to carry out with Vulcan Centaur as well. In recent months, the Space Force has already expressed discontent and frustration with ULA and their inability to keep up with the launch cadence that they already need to maintain for their obligations to the Space Force. In my opinion, there's absolutely no way that ULA would be able to handle 28 additional launches on top of all of their obligations, meaning that if Trump dumps SpaceX completely, the national security launches are going to be years behind, and the U.S. Space Force is not going to be able to keep up all of the reconnaissance obligations that they have to keep an eye on Russia and China and other enemies of the U.S. who are currently building up quite a space launch capability themselves. As a matter of fact, the Chinese military would utterly eclipse the U.S. military in terms of launch capability if SpaceX were to lose all of their government contracts. How is this possible? How did the United States make themselves so incredibly dependent on one launch provider to where if they lose that launch provider, all of their plans in space will essentially fall to pieces? How could the U.S. have allowed this situation to take place? Well, I've been talking about this for years. The U.S. was never very well advised to put so much responsibility on SpaceX and nobody else. They didn't really have much of a choice because SpaceX was the only company for quite some time that had the heavy lift capability of bringing these heavy national security satellites out to geosynchronous orbit. There aren't too many rockets that can do that sort of thing, but nevertheless, a lack of competition is never a good thing, and I've said that over and over again. And by the way, that applies to getting rid of SpaceX also. If that were to happen and ULA essentially has a monopoly with Blue Origin starting to compete, but really it's going to be a while before New Glenn is up to a high launch cadence itself, that's going to be just as awful, if not worse. We need many robust launch providers in order to have a dominant and effective launch industry in the United States, and getting rid of all of SpaceX's government contracts would serve only to damage the United States' supremacy in space. As a matter of fact, it would probably wipe it out. And Trump could make things even worse. For example, SpaceX's Starlink business is largely dependent on the good graces of the FCC. Currently, of course, they're allowed to do pretty much anything they want to, at least in regards to their license. As long as they don't violate their license in any serious regard, Starlink can operate any way that they want to. But should the FCC decide to revoke that license, at least in the United States, Starlink would no longer have any customers, which would be utterly devastating. And the FAA, for their their part, could start inhibiting SpaceX's launches for other clients, other commercial launches that they have, and make those very difficult to carry out, making SpaceX a lot less attractive to prospective customers. In other words, Trump theoretically could devastate SpaceX and quite possibly put them out of business. Now, of course, a lot of you are probably saying that Elon would take all of this to court, you would get federal judges to find in his favor, etc., etc. But as we have seen lately, the U.S. Supreme Court, which is largely stacked with Trump's people, have been making a number of judgments in his favor. And as we all know, legal matters can take a long time to resolve, and in that time, SpaceX would lose a lot of money and might very well go bankrupt. Again, this is all theoretical. This is all worst case scenario stuff as to what Trump could, at least in theory, do to SpaceX and how he could bring them down if he really wanted to. And of course, in regards to the whole deportation thing, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go into the legalities of whether or not that would be possible, but suffice it to say that Trump seems to be capable of kicking naturalized citizens out of the country, and there are precedents in history for removing naturalized citizens from the United States if they're behaving in a manner that's not in the nation's best interests. And there have been examples of people who are, for example, supporting Hamas or supporting Palestinian liberation, who are naturalized citizens, who have still been arrested and are in the process of being deported, although some of these people have had their cases overturned. So once again, hard to say, but if that were to happen, Elon could definitely wreak some horrific revenge on Trump and the United States. For one thing, as I've mentioned before, the U.S. wouldn't be able to keep up all of their national security obligations out in space, giving China a key advantage. And secondly, if Elon were no longer a U.S. citizen, he might very well take all of his technology and set up a new SpaceX in Shanghai or Beijing. Not only that, Elon has first-hand experience with the most advanced reconnaissance satellites that the U.S. Space Force has at its disposal. His company has integrated these payloads. He would have the capability of transferring that technology to his new patrons in China or Russia. He would be an unbelievably useful espionage asset. Now, of course, you could say that he was a traitor if he were to do something like that and prosecute him, assuming the United States could get their hands on him again. But if you had taken his citizenship away from him without any good cause, who really betrayed who here? Nevertheless, yes, definitely the United States would prosecute him as being a spy, but as Edward Snowden has demonstrated over the years, even if you're not a billionaire, you can hide away for quite some time without being prosecuted for these sorts of things. And Elon, especially if he was being protected by his new allies, would probably be very difficult, if not impossible, to apprehend. Now, of course, I'm really going to extremes here, but I thought it would be an interesting exercise to explore just how far these two guys could take these things, just how much damage these men could do, not only to each other, but to the U.S. taxpayers, U.S. technological supremacy, and to the U.S. military. When it comes right down to it, these guys going all the way when it comes to going to war with one another is not going to do anybody any good. Everybody loses and nobody wins. Well, nobody, that is, except maybe for the communist Chinese. So for what it's worth, I hope this feud ends. I hope this whole thing wraps up somehow, and it wraps up in a way that's at least a little less devastating than it appears to be heading at this particular time. I mean, I don't think it's going to do anybody any good, as I said in the video, if a major competitor in the spaceflight arena, that is to say SpaceX, goes away. because there's nobody that's capable of taking on the responsibility for the Space Force or anything else that they're supposed to be doing for the government. Nobody else, as you saw in the video, has the capability of doing that. But it's more significant than that. With everything that the United States loses from SpaceX, it's very possible that countries like China are going to gain. After all, if Elon's been deported, as I said, no longer an American citizen, well, I think it's very possible that he could take his technology over to China and make them the dominant force in space. Would this be an act of espionage? Would this be a crime? Yeah, quite possibly. But at the same time, I think that the Chinese would probably do everything they could to protect their new asset. The fact of the matter is, this feud benefits nobody. This is just going to end up badly for all the major players if it continues to escalate. Both Trump and Musk, for their own well-being, need to calm the down. And if they don't, well, I don't hold out a great deal of hope for the future of U.S. spaceflight. Thanks very much for watching. Also, please keep in mind that we just released a new piece of merchandise yesterday. Not a lot of people watched the video associated with it, but if you are inclined to support NASA, to at least state that you're not happy with these cuts that NASA is being hit with in the big, beautiful bill, well, you can state your opinions publicly with this amazing piece of merchandise, an amazing shirt that we're releasing through the help of Sunline. Super impressed with the art that they put out for this. And also, these shirts are so comfortable. I'm wearing one of them now, as you can see, the I Told You UFOs Are Real shirt. And by the way, this is a very, very limited release shirt. This is probably going to be gone by July 5th. We don't have a lot of time for it because, after all, the big, beautiful bill is likely to pass by then as well. But if you value U.S. space flight, because after all, if SpaceX is gone and NASA is gutted, there's not going to be a whole lot left as far as space is concerned in the U.S. after that. If you want to state your opinions publicly, well, this is a way to do it. And also keep in mind, you'll get a tax-deductible donation to the Planetary Society associated with your purchase. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, stay angry about space.